I'm Margaret Halbrook, 82 years old, and I still wake up before the sun rises. The habit's hard to break after decades spent in the field chasing traces of the past with a trowel and a notebook. My body isn't what it used to be, so every morning starts slow. Right leg first, then left, careful not to lean too fast. The cane by the wall is always waiting for me. Sturdy oak with a smooth handle. I bought it in Cairo in 1979. Back when it was more style than necessity. Now it's the only reason I dare the stairs at all. This morning was like any other, until the mail arrived and I saw the Cambridge seal. Before we go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to fight for respect in your own family. I live in Gladstone, Oregon, a quiet neighborhood where folks still wave when they see you from the porch. I can watch the world. Wake up. Mr. Watkins walks his Labrador just after 7. Mrs. Dorsey waters her rose beds across the street. Everyone's got their rhythm around here. I found mine. Too hot. Tea. 1 sugar. No cream. Then I sit in my armchair and breathe through the stiffness of the night. The house isn't large, but it's filled with my life photographs from expeditions, books stacked too deep on every shelf, field, notes, maps pressed between yellowing paperweights. The coffee table holds a clay figurine from Anatolia. Not the original, of course, the real one's in London, but this replica was given to me by a colleague the day we published the paper that changed everything. I spent 40 years in the field. My late husband Jim and I, both archaeologists, met at a dig in Kansas and married under a desert sky. Our daughter Lucia was born between seasons in a tent that swayed in the wind. We weren't a conventional family. Our holidays were spent in Cairo or Damascus. Our Christmases often came with sand in our shoes. But we had joy and purpose and wonder in those days when Jim passed. It was like the color left the landscape. Our daughter had just started her sophomore year of college. She came home for the funeral, but something in her changed after that. She used to write postcards from everywhere she visited. Now, years pass between her calls. I stayed close to what mattered. The work, the records, the pieces of time we left behind in the soil, and yet nothing prepared me for what came next. That morning, the letter from Cambridge arrived with my name printed in black ink, Dr. Margaret Halbrook. It was from Harris Wilet, one of my former students, now a professor himself. A field team in Syria had uncovered pottery marked with carvings we'd only seen once before in 1983. He wrote, they matched the pattern I described in a now-forgotten article. He attached photos and asked for my thoughts. I set the letter down just as the phone rang. The sound still startles me. Even now, all those years in remote places taught me to treat sudden noise as warning. I answered on the 3rd ring. It was Lucia. She never says hello first, just starts with what she needs this time. It was about a barbecue. Greg wants you to come on Saturday, she said flatly. 3 o'clock. Don't bring anything. I didn't ask if she wanted me there. I knew better by now. She always calls last minute like she's checking a box. I baked oatmeal cookies anyway. Greg's on a strict diet, but I made them like I used to for Lucia when she was 7, always added cinnamon, just a touch. She never mentions the cookies anymore, just nods and moves on to the next topic. She and Greg live 15 minutes away. But the distance feels wider each year. Their house is all clean lines and chrome-framed photos of Greg's parents line the wall. Not one of mine. I'm used to that too. I bring gifts for my granddaughter Leela, trinkets from the past, small stones from the Atlas Mountains, pressed flowers from Turkey, little things that hold stories. She's too young to understand and too polite to refuse. Saturday came, and Lucia picked me up on time. As always, her eyes scanned my outfit before I even reached the car. It'll be hot, she said flatly. You sure you want to wear that? I told her I'd worked in deserts hotter than this one. She didn't laugh. She never laughs at my stories anymore. When we pulled up to the house, the party was already buzzing. Strangers, mostly laughter spilled from the backyard. Greg waved, but didn't approach. Lucia walked ahead without waiting. I followed carefully. Cane in one hand, small wrapped gift in the other. My knees ached, but I didn't complain. I've never been one to speak before. I'm sure of the terrain. I didn't know then that by the end of the afternoon, I'd be soaking wet in front of a laughing crowd, and that everything I'd worked to preserve my name, my dignity, my place in this family, would be washed away with the chlorine. Greg's backyard was already full when we arrived. The smell of grilled meat hung in the air, and the sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifted across the lawn. Lucia walked ahead, barely glancing over her shoulder to see if I was keeping up. I took my time crossing the yard, the grass soft and uneven beneath my shoes. My cane sank slightly with each step, and I had to steady myself before moving forward again. No one seemed to notice. No one offered a hand or moved a chair. I spotted Chris near the patio, surrounded by a group of women in matching pastel blouses. She gave me a polite nod, but didn't interrupt her conversation. Greg was manning the grill, flanked by a few men holding beers, laughing at something I couldn't hear clearly. I eased myself down into the nearest chair, the one not already claimed or surrounded. My knees ached from the walk, but I said nothing. Across the yard, little Leela was playing near the swing set. I raised a hand and waved. She didn't see me. Lucia came by a few minutes later, holding a glass of lemonade. Here, she said, placing it in my hand. Just don't spill it. I thanked her, trying not to let my hands shake. The lemonade was warm. Too sweet. I held it anyway. Conversations buzzed around me, but I didn't follow them. People were talking about interest rates, sports trades, someone's new kitchen remodel. I listened, smiled when it felt right, nodded when I thought I should. At some point, Milo found me. He was the only one who always did. He sat beside me and handed over a plate light on food, heavy on kindness. "Hey, Grandma," he said. "It's been a while. How are you feeling?" I told him about the letter from Cambridge about the ceramic fragments and how they might confirm a theory we'd once explored in northern Syria. Milo listened. He always had a good ear for stories that didn't involve cars or mortgages. He asked real questions. He remembered details. He didn't look at his phone while I spoke. "I still have that book you gave me on Mesopotamian city-states," he said. "It's in my office." I smiled just a little. That book had traveled with me across 3 continents before it ever reached his hands. Then John's voice broke through. "Still loading people up with your old bones, Mom." He was standing behind us, beer in hand, grinning that same grin he used when he wanted to seem lighthearted, but still make sure his words stung. "I was just telling Milo about the find," I said. "Bones, shards, dusty books." He waved his free hand. She was always obsessed with that stuff. My friends used to call my parents grave robbers. Milo gave a half-hearted chuckle. "Technically, it's archaeology." John nodded and looked around. "Anyway, Mom, nobody here wants to hear about artifacts. Why don't you tell me if that new security system I installed is working?" "It's working fine," I lied. I'd turned it off after 2 days. The beeping drove me crazy. He gave me a thumbs up and wandered off, calling to someone near the grill. Milo stood a few minutes later. "I should help with the music," he said. "I'll come back." I nodded. I always did. The sun was higher now. Heat sat heavy on my shoulders. My hearing aid let out a sharp buzz, then went quiet. I reached up, adjusted it, turned the volume up. No change. The muffled voices around me felt farther away than ever. I sat still for a moment, trying to focus, trying not to feel the exhaustion creeping up my spine. I decided to find Leela to give her the little gift I'd brought. It was a small music box filled with colored stones from places most people only read about. I rose slowly, testing my balance, and walked toward the swings. The pool sat between me and the children's area. It was shallow-edged with smooth concrete, surrounded by a waist-high fence meant more for decoration than safety. I took the path around it, my cane tapping lightly as I moved. I didn't see John approach from behind, but I heard his voice, playful, too loud. "Hey, Mom, want to go for a swim?" Before I could turn, I felt a push firm, deliberate. My cane slipped from my hand. The ground shifted. My body hit the waters with a slap that stole the air from my lungs. The cold knocked everything out of me. My dress clung tight, heavy with water. The hearing aid screeched once, then went silent. I reached for the side, but the wet stone was slick beneath my fingers. My knees wouldn't bend right. My arms felt too slow. Laughter rang in the air. John's voice again. "Cool off, Mom?" I couldn't speak loud enough to ask for help. I wasn't sure anyone would have listened if I had. Someone joked about throwing me a floaty. Another voice called me a sea witch. Someone was filming. I could feel it. That quiet pause in a crowd when someone hits record. Then Milo was in the water. He didn't ask, didn't speak. Just reached for me and lifted me up his arms, steady, his grip sure. "I've got you," he said quietly. "Just hold on." He helped me to the edge where Greg offered a hand and helped lift me onto a lounge chair. The wet fabric clung to every inch of me. My knees throbbed. My hip burned. My brooch, the silver scarab Jim gave me, was gone. John brought a towel. "God, Mom," he said. It was a joke. "Don't be so dramatic." I didn't answer. My teeth chattered. I held the towel close but didn't feel any warmer. Heather hovered. "I've got dry clothes inside," she offered. "Leela still wants to show you her new bike." "I want to go home," I said. "We haven't even had dessert yet," she replied. "I want to go home." That time they heard me. "I'll drive her," Milo said. His clothes were still damp hair flattened to his forehead. No, John objected. "You've got work tomorrow. I'll take her." He talked about me like I wasn't there. Not once did he offer a hand as I stood. Milo helped me up. Someone handed me my bag soaked through. The box inside was ruined. Leela ran up as we passed the sandbox. "Grandma, why are you wet?" "I fell in the pool, honey," I said gently. "Are you a mermaid?" "She's an old mermaid who needs to dry off," John said, chuckling. Milo looked at him but said nothing. John opened the passenger door. Milo leaned in. "Let me grab a towel for the seat." "It'll survive," John muttered. The car ride was silent except for the sound of water squishing from my clothes into the leather upholstery. "In June," John said, looking at me. "You cold." "I'm soaked," I said. "Please turn on the heat." He sighed, turned a knob. It was a joke, he said again. Everyone laughed. "You didn't have to turn it into a scene. You pushed me." It was a light push. I could have hit my head. I could have drowned. "You always exaggerate." Back at my house, he didn't park. Didn't offer to help me to the door. I stepped out on my own and stood there as he drove away. Inside, I peeled off the wet clothes one piece at a time. My limbs ached from the effort. I sat at the edge of my bed towel, wrapped tight around my shoulders. I looked at the bruises already forming on my arms. Yellow-gray smudges under thin skin. The next 3 days were a fog of fever, coughing, and pain. I didn't answer the phone. I didn't move more than I had to. By the 4th day, I forced myself out of bed. My fingers trembled as I typed a reply to Harris. I had to correct the same line 3 times, but I kept going. Halfway through, the phone rang again. I saw Milo's name and picked up. "Grandma," he said. "How are you?" "I've been better," I answered, "but I'll survive." He hesitated. Dad said, "You're ignoring his calls." He didn't call. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have come sooner." We talked about his job, about his girlfriend Rachel, about his plans for summer. When the call ended, I sat for a long while staring at the picture of Jim on my desk. Then I reached for the hearing aid, still silent, still ruined, and set it down gently beside my cold cup of tea. The fever broke late Friday night. I woke damp and aching, but the sharp chill that had settled in my bones had finally lifted. The bedroom was still except for the faint hum of the fan in the corner. I reached for my robe, careful not to twist my hip the wrong way, and moved slowly toward the kitchen. Each step carried the weight of 4 days spent in bed. The teapot was where I'd left it. I filled it and set it on the stove, leaning on the counter while it heated. The house felt quiet in a different way, now less like silence, more like distance. I hadn't heard from John. Not once since the barbecue. Not a single call. Not a note. Chris hadn't reached out either. I hadn't expected them to, but still. The new hearing aid appointment was scheduled for Monday. I'd called Dr. Chen's office that morning, holding the phone close to my good ear and raising my voice over the ringing tone. The receptionist had been kind, said they could fit me in after lunch. I was grateful for that. The broken one lay in a small bowl by the back door next to the basket of keys. Its plastic casing was still waterlogged, its battery compartment rusted. I spent most of the weekend reading through old journals. Jim had labeled each one in his neat, all-capital handwriting, Tel Halef, March 1978. Euphrates, West Bank, summer 1981. They still smelled faintly of desert dust and the cedar oil we used to keep insects out of our field kits. The notes were faded but clear, his sketches still precise after all these years. I kept a pen nearby to circle anything that might help me respond to Harris's letter. On Monday, I took a cab to the audiologist's office. The driver was young and quiet. He helped me out of the car when we arrived and offered an arm, which I politely declined. Inside, the receptionist checked me in with a soft smile, and I waited in the small, cool room surrounded by posters of human ears and frequency charts. Dr. Chen was gentle. She examined the damaged hearing aid, confirmed what I already knew. "It's beyond repair," she said, setting it aside. "We'll order a new one. Insurance covers part of the cost, but there's a balance of just under $2,000. I nodded. The price didn't surprise me. I wrote a check for the down payment and signed the paperwork for an installment plan. When the assistant handed me the receipt, she addressed me as Dr. Halbrook. I hadn't heard that in a long time, not in person. The words settled warmly in the space between us. That evening, I made myself a simple dinner: soft bread, a bowl of soup, half a pear, and carried it to the table by the window. The sky outside was a pale wash of color, the last of the daylight stretching over the rooftops. I ate slowly, thinking about Jim, about the early years when we still camped in canvas tents and took photographs with film. The doorbell rang while I was finishing my tea. I pulled my sweater tight and stepped to the door, the cane steady in my hand. John was standing on the porch. He held a paper bag, the kind from the bakery near his office. "I brought you the cinnamon buns you like," he said. I opened the door wider and stepped aside. "Come in." He walked into the living room, glancing around like he hadn't seen the place before. "You look better," he said. "It was a cold," I replied. "It happens when you get pushed into a pool." John made a face, but didn't respond. "I called a few times. My hearing aid's broken," I said. I couldn't hear the phone unless I was right next to it. "Oh, right." He scratched the back of his neck. "I meant to buy you a new one. It's already ordered," I told him. Dr. Chen placed the request this morning. "How much is it?" he asked. $2,000. Insurance covers some. I've made the first payment." "Mom, don't be silly," he said. "Let me pay for it. There's no need." He looked away, studied the photo on the mantel of me and Jim standing at the Tel Halef dig site. "I mean, I feel like I should, after what happened." "You mean the joke I said?" He sighed. "You're still stuck on that." "You pushed me. It was a light push." Everyone laughed. "You didn't have to make it a scene." "I didn't make it a scene." "You did." "Here we go," he muttered. More drama. I held my hands together in my lap. You pushed your 82-year-old mother into a pool, knowing I have arthritis and a hearing aid. And now you're irritated that I wasn't amused. He looked like he wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. There was a long pause, just the ticking of the kitchen clock behind us. I came to apologize, he said eventually. I nodded. Apology accepted. Chris is making dinner next Sunday, he added. Just a quiet one. She'd like you to come. I agreed, though every part of me hesitated. John left shortly after the bag of cinnamon buns resting on the counter. I stared at them for a while after he drove off. I didn't particularly like them. Never had. Dinner at their house was quiet, but the quiet didn't feel warm. Chris made fried chicken. It was dry, but I complimented it anyway. John talked about work a new car, the roof repairs. Small things, the kind you talk about when you're trying not to touch anything real. At one point, Chris looked over. How's your hearing, Margaret? It's improving, I said. The new aid should arrive next week. Must be hard not hearing clearly, she added. I manage. John set down his fork. Chris and I were thinking maybe it's time to look into a care home. Not right now, of course, just in the long run. I didn't answer right away. A lot of people your age live in places like that, Chris said, gently. You'd be safer. I'm safe where I am. But if you fell, John said, who would help you? You installed an emergency system. Remember, it's not the same as having professionals around, Chris said. I laid my fork down. I'm capable of deciding how and where I live. I'm not planning to give up my independence because of a poolside joke. They didn't argue after that. Just exchanged a glance I knew too well the look shared between people who've already made a plan. Back home, I made tea and settled into my chair. The lights were low. The house was quiet again, but it felt different than it had before. I looked at Harris's letter on the side table, still open where I'd left it. He'd called me Dr. Halbrook. He asked for my expertise. He respected the work. The contrast was sharp, and it stayed with me long after I turned off the lights. The morning after that dinner, I woke to a sky washed in soft gray. Rain had passed through overnight, and the street outside was slick with puddles. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, my hands resting on my knees, listening to the clock tick. My legs ached more than usual. I reached for the cane before I moved slowly to the window, and watched as a blue jay hopped along the edge of the porch railing. There was a calm in the room that I hadn't felt in a long time. A different kind of stillness, not silence, exactly something more settled. I made tea the same way I always did and carried it to my desk near the front window. The envelope from Cambridge was still there. I'd read Harris's letter at least a dozen times, but that morning I picked it up again. His handwriting hadn't changed much, tight slanted slightly to the right. He'd signed it, "With admiration, Harris." No title, no distance. I sat down, slid open the drawer, and took out a fresh sheet of paper. The first line came easily. Dear Harris, thank you for trusting me with this. I paused, then added, the pattern on the base reminds me of the finds near Al Raqqa. We never did resolve that layer, did we? My fingers were stiff, but I kept going. The words came slower than they used to, but they came. I worked through a second page before stopping to rest my hand. I looked around the room. The bookshelf, the photos, the clay seal from Tel Halaf. I thought of John of Chris of the dinner table, where my life had been discussed like a scheduling problem. It was quiet again, the good kind. I finished my tea and walked to the back room, the one Jim and I had always called the archive, though no one else would call it that. Boxes lined the walls carefully labeled. Egypt, Syria, Anatolia. Each one held something we'd saved, field notes, artifact tags, drawings, small finds cleared through customs decades ago. I pulled the oldest box from the bottom shelf and opened it. Inside was a bundle of photos rubber banded together. Jim younger than I remembered, me wearing that wide-brimmed canvas hat, and John, maybe 9 years old, squinting into the sun, holding a pottery shard in both hands like it was made of gold. I brought the box to the table and sorted the contents into small piles. Some needed relabeling, a few I hadn't seen in years. I picked up a small, flat piece of stone worn smooth on one side. I remembered finding it in the desert near Aleppo, the wind cutting across the plain, the light changing quickly as the sun lowered. That evening, I called John. He picked up on the third ring. "Hey, Mom," he said, sounding surprised. "Everything okay? I wanted to let you know. I said I won't be able to make lunch this weekend." There was a pause. "Why not? I've started cataloging the collection," I said. "It's going to take time." He didn't say anything for a second. "The collection in the basement." "That's right. You're canceling lunch for that?" "I am. Is this about the nursing home thing?" he asked. "No," I said. "This is about my work." He let out a breath. "You're 82, and my mind is still sound." He went quiet again. "You know, Heather wanted you to come to Leela's birthday next month." "She didn't ask me directly. She told me to ask you." "You didn't. I thought you'd assume. I don't assume anymore." "Mom, you know she wants you there." I didn't answer. He tried again. "Don't you want to see your great-granddaughter?" "She barely knows who I am." "You're her grandmother." "I'm also a researcher," I said. "And right now, I'm working." "You're not in a lab," he said, trying to laugh. "You're in your basement. There's not much difference." He was quiet again. "So you're saying no. I'm saying I have other priorities." I could hear the disbelief in his breath. "Well, okay then. I'll tell Chris." I thanked him and hung up. I stayed at the table for a long while after the call. The rain had started again, light and steady. I returned to the stack of photos and lifted one I hadn't seen in decades. Jim crouched beside a trench wall, his hand tracing a pattern in the clay sunlight, catching the curve of his shoulder. I slid it into a new folder marked Tel Halaf Site A, 1979. A few days later, a call came from the Gladstone Museum. The director introduced herself as Margaret Phelps, and she didn't waste time. "Dr. Halbrook," she said, "I read your article on Mesopotamian kiln structures in graduate school. It changed the way I dated our regional samples." I wasn't sure what to say. "We're holding a lecture series," she continued, "on ancient trade systems. I was hoping you'd consider presenting. I know it's short notice, but we'd be honored." The words were measured, but there was something warm behind them. I asked for the date. She gave it mid-next month, 3 days after Leela's birthday. "I'd love to," I said. "We'll handle everything she promised. Just bring yourself and your stories." That night, I added the lecture date to my calendar and looked again at the birthday invitation that had arrived in the mail that morning. It was pink glittery with a cartoon princess on the front. A handwritten note from Heather said Leela would love to see you. I didn't feel guilty setting it aside. I opened a new file on my laptop and began listing topics for the lecture. Clay distribution patterns, paint composition by region, trade across the Tigris. I filled the page, then moved on to slides, photographs I'd kept in the archives, scanned years ago, but still usable. The next morning, I stood in the basement and looked at the wall of boxes. Each one held something that mattered. Each one belonged to a world that still welcomed me. The following Tuesday, I rode the city bus to the university archives. The stop was just 2 blocks from the museum, and I knew the walk would be slow. But I had my cane, and the weather was cool enough for a light coat, just a breeze over the river. I hadn't been to the archives since Jim passed. Back then, we still signed in with paper logs. Now the student worker at the front desk handed me a name badge with a barcode and asked if I needed help finding a terminal. "I'll manage," I told her. I settled at a corner desk and spread out the notes I'd brought. The folder was thick with references, Jim's handwriting maps we'd sketched in camp printouts from microfilm I hadn't looked at in years. I pulled out one in particular. It showed a series of kiln outlines from tel afar drawn in red pencil with margins covered in question marks. One mark stood out, Jim's initials next to a number I didn't recognize. That was the piece Harris had asked about. I typed slowly at first. The interface had changed, but the search functions were mostly the same. I looked up the excavation records from 1980 to 1983 and cross-referenced the site codes. It took time, but by mid-afternoon, I found the catalog entry that matched the number. It wasn't from tel afar at all. It was from a crate marked Halbrook West Bank 4B, transferred to a British collection in 1986. That was the year Jim got sick. I made a note, copied the page, and requested the transfer records from Cambridge. The student assistant helped me print the forms, and I placed everything in a new folder marked Harris Inquiry. When I stood to leave, the muscles in my legs had tightened, but I felt steadier than I had in weeks. At the bus stop, I dialed Harris's number. He answered on the third ring. "Dr. Halbrook," he said warmly. "Margaret," I corrected. "I found your shard." There was a long pause, then a quiet, "You did?" It was misfiled. "We marked it, West Bank, but it was Tel Halaf Layer 4. The transfer number places it in your Cambridge basement 4th shelf." He let out a breath. "That's incredible. I've searched that shelf half a dozen times. You were looking for the wrong label." He laughed. "Would you ever consider coming to Cambridge? We could use someone who knows how to read between the lines." "I have a lecture next month," I said. "But after that, let's talk." We agreed to stay in touch. I hung up and watched a squirrel dart across the sidewalk, its tail flicking wildly as it climbed a power line. It felt good doing the work, solving something. That weekend, Chris called. She didn't mention the canceled lunch or the birthday party. Instead, she asked if I'd thought any more about the move. "I haven't," I said. "I saw a place in Madison that has excellent ratings. Private apartments, a garden courtyard, even pottery classes." "I have a garden here, but no elevator," I manage. "I just want what's best for you," she said. "I know." She paused. "Leela made you a card. Thank her for me. She doesn't understand why you didn't come. She'll understand someday." Chris didn't respond to that. We ended the call politely. The next day, I called the museum again. Margaret Phelps answered on the second ring. I was wondering, I said, if I could bring some of my artifacts to display during the lecture. "Just as reference." "Of course," she said, sounding pleased. "We'd be honored. We can provide a locked case and insurance paperwork." That evening, I dusted off the large wooden chest Jim had built. It held our personal finds, the pieces we'd kept for study, not resale or exhibition. I chose 5, a carved seal from Nineveh, a spindle whorl with etched detail, a shard with a rare cobalt glaze, one of Jim's maps drawn in charcoal, and a fragment of a bone tool he'd always believed was ceremonial. I packed them carefully in acid-free paper and labeled each one in both Arabic and English. My hands trembled a little, not from age, but from the care it took to wrap them just right. The house was quiet that night. I sat at my desk and opened a new document on the laptop. The lecture draft had only a title so far, Invisible Threads Trade Labor and the Women of Tel Halaf. I'd decided on the focus during the archive visit. So much of our fieldwork had overlooked the hands that shaped the clay, spun the thread, built the homes. Jim used to say, "History forgets the laborers." I started with the pottery. Described the fingerprints still visible under glaze, the hand-stamped motifs passed from mother to daughter. I included a photo of a kiln cross-section annotated with my notes, each sentence built on the last. I wrote, slowly stopping only when the light outside had faded to blue. The next morning, I printed the first draft and read it aloud to myself. The words sounded right, clear, firm. I didn't tell John about the lecture, not yet. But later that week, a letter arrived in the mail. Thick cream paper, embossed envelope. The return address was the University of Cambridge. Inside was an invitation, official and formal, inviting me to join a symposium on ancient economic systems. They wanted me to present a keynote, expenses paid. Spring of next year. I held the letter in my lap for a long time. The edges curled under my fingers. The quiet in the house had shifted again. It wasn't empty, it was waiting. The morning of the lecture arrived cool and dry. A soft light fell across the kitchen floor as I filled the kettle and opened the curtains. My notes were already packed, along with the artifacts I'd chosen, carefully labeled and wrapped. The museum had arranged transportation, but I insisted on arriving early. I wanted time to settle before the audience filtered in. The driver, a kind man named Ray, lifted the display case into the trunk and made polite conversation as we drove. He asked what I would be speaking on. I told him trade routes and the hands that made them. He nodded thoughtfully, but didn't press for more. The museum's lecture hall was warm, the walls paneled in honey-colored wood. Margaret met me at the door with a folder and a reassuring smile. "We're honored to have you," she said. "The audience includes a few students, some local historians, and half the board." She led me to the front where my display had been set in a glass case beside the podium. My seal stone, the bone tool, the cobalt fragment, they looked smaller under the lights, but no less important. People began to arrive in twos and threes. A pair of young women in scarves, a retired librarian with a notebook, a man I recognized from the university's old anthropology department. Then, just as Margaret adjusted the mic and tested the audio, I saw them, John and Chris. They entered quietly and sat near the back. Chris held Leela in her lap, her curls pulled into matching pink bows. I met John's eyes for a moment. He gave a small nod, barely there. I nodded back. Margaret tapped the mic. "Thank you all for coming. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Margaret Halbrook, whose work on Mesopotamian economic systems has shaped much of our understanding today." I stepped up to the podium. The first words came slowly, then gathered rhythm. I spoke of clay and fire, of the weight of a woman's hand pressing design into pottery. I spoke of trade routes traced not on maps, but in fingerprints left beneath glaze. I showed photos, told stories, and paused only when the crowd needed time to absorb. Halfway through, I glanced toward the back. John leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. Chris had turned Leela in her lap to face me. I kept going. Near the end, I unwrapped the carved spindle whorl and held it up. "This was likely made by someone whose name we'll never know," I said. But her work traveled farther than she ever did. It crossed borders, changed hands, and still speaks today. When the lecture ended, the applause was soft but steady. A few people approached to ask questions. Margaret stood nearby, fielding comments. I saw Chris whisper something to John, then walk up with Leela still on her hip. She wanted to say something. Chris said. Leela stretched out one hand toward the display case. "Pretty rock." I smiled. "That's called a seal stone. People used it to stamp things like a signature. Did you find it? I did." "Cool," she said, then nestled back against Chris's shoulder. "Thank you for letting her come," I said. Chris looked at me carefully. "She asked to see you. Not just today. She's been asking." "I didn't know. I didn't tell you." We stood there a moment longer. "You were incredible," she said, gesturing toward the podium. "I was prepared," I said. "I always am." John joined us after a moment, his expression unreadable. "You still have it?" he said. "The way you talk about it, it's like the dust is still in your hair." "I remember how it felt," I said. He glanced at the seal stone. I forgot how much you loved it. You didn't forget. You just didn't look. We didn't say more. A few minutes later, they gathered their things and left. Leela waved once from the lobby, her fingers wiggling in the air. I stayed behind to answer questions from a graduate student who'd come in from Minneapolis. She asked if I still kept field notes. I told her I never stopped. That night, I returned home to find a message on the machine. It was from a publishing house, one I hadn't worked with in over 20 years. They'd heard about the lecture, they said. Would I consider expanding it into a short volume? Something personal, perhaps, with photographs, a blend of memoir and fieldwork. I wrote down the number. 2 days later, another envelope arrived from Cambridge, this one with travel forms and a speaking schedule. They'd arranged accommodations for 2 weeks should I want to stay longer. I brought the envelope to my desk, set it beside the lecture draft, and looked out the window. The mailbox across the street leaned slightly left, the way it always had. A squirrel darted through the branches of the elm tree. The world was exactly as it had been. Only, I was different now. The museum's spring gala was held on the second Saturday of May, just as the azaleas along the entrance path were beginning to bloom. Margaret, the program coordinator, had asked if I'd be willing to present an award at the closing ceremony. It would mean a lot, she'd said. We're honoring a young curator who built her thesis on your early fieldwork. I agreed without thinking too hard about it. The lecture had opened something that had been quiet in me for a long time. A door I'd left closed. They mailed me a formal invitation with embossed lettering. Dr. Margaret Halbrook, it read. It had been years since I'd seen my name printed like that. The RSVP card was tucked inside along with a schedule for the evening and a note about reserved seating. I arrived 15 minutes early in a dark navy dress with long sleeves. The kind of dress you wear when you want to be both present and quiet. Ray dropped me off near the West Wing entrance where staff volunteers greeted guests and handed out programs. My name was already on the list. One of the volunteers took my arm and led me through the lobby and into the main hall. The room was gently lit soft gold against the stone columns. Tables were arranged in a circle, each centerpiece built from artifacts or replica pieces, clay lamps, scrolls, woven mats. It was thoughtful, personal without being obvious. My table was near the front. A small tent card with Dr. Halbrook printed in careful script rested beside the floral arrangement. I placed my bag beneath the chair, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. The seat beside me shifted, and I turned to see John easing into place. "Your name was on the list?" he said, smoothing his jacket. "Figured I'd come early." Chris arrived a few minutes later with Leela now in a soft green dress that matched the ribbon in her hair. She waved when she saw me. "Grandma Maggie," she whispered, grinning. The ceremony began with a brief welcome from the museum director. Then came the keynote speech, followed by the award presentations. I listened closely, letting the rhythm of the room carry me. When they called my name, there was a quiet murmur through the audience. Some turned in their seats. I walked to the podium slowly, but without hesitation. Margaret stood beside me, her hand light on my shoulder. She introduced me with a few words about legacy and resilience, then stepped back. I held the award in one hand and looked toward the recipient, a young woman named Haley. She rose from her table with wide eyes, cheeks flushed. I handed her the plaque and leaned in slightly. "You've chosen good ground," I said. "Dig deep." The audience applauded as she returned to her seat. I stayed at the podium just a moment longer, then added, "And thank you for remembering the hands that came before yours." As I stepped down, a soft voice behind me said, "Dr. Halbrook, I've read everything you wrote about Shahri Sokta, a man in his 40s, glasses tucked into his collar. You're the reason I applied for this fellowship." I thanked him, shook his hand, and moved back to my table. Leela had a cookie in one hand and a juice cup in the other. "They said your name into a microphone?" she whispered. "They did," I said, and people clapped. Yes. At the end of the evening, as coats were gathered and goodbyes made, Margaret approached once more. "We'd like to feature your story," she said, "not just in the archives, as a permanent exhibit. Your work, your field notes, maybe even your voice." I was quiet for a moment. Chris had joined us then. Leela nestled against her side. "We want the next generation to understand where this work begins," Margaret said. "And who it belongs to." I looked at the woman standing in front of me, then at the daughter beside me, and the granddaughter watching it all. 3 generations, not always close, but suddenly present in the same room, with the same story. I nodded. Outside, the air had cooled. Chris walked beside me while John brought the car around. "I never said it properly," she murmured. "I didn't press. I was angry for a long time," she said. "And then I just let it harden. Rock layers do that," I said gently. "Until someone chips away." She looked at me. "Would you? If we brought Leela by once a week, would you teach her? Not just about artifacts, but all of it?" I met her eyes. "Yes, I would." Leela tugged at her mother's coat. "Can I come tomorrow?" Chris smiled. "Let's start next week." That night, I placed the program from the gala beside my typewriter. The Cambridge papers were already filled out. The publishing house had called again and left a second message. I hadn't returned it yet, but I would. The first time Leela sat across from me with a notebook in her lap, the late morning light was catching the edge of my teacup. She had a purple pencil and a list of questions. "What does stratigraphy mean?" she asked, looking at me with the same steady curiosity I used to see in Chris when she was little. I answered slowly, explaining layers and time and patience, and she scribbled notes in her uneven handwriting. Each week, she came back with more. Some questions about ruins and ancient tools, others about family, about what her mom was like at her age, about why we used to live so far apart. Chris joined us sometimes, sitting quietly at the table, listening while she folded laundry or sliced fruit. The silences between us had softened. Some days she'd ask things too, not always about the past, sometimes about the future. "Do you think I'm doing okay?" she asked, once her voice barely above a whisper. With her, I looked at her, really looked, and said, "Yes." She knows she's loved. That's everything. John built Leela a wooden case for her field tools. Nothing fancy, just a small box with her initials carved into the lid. She brought it with her every visit, a brush, a hand lens, measuring tape. I taught her how to draw what she saw before she named it. Observation before interpretation, I'd say, and she'd nod like it was a sacred rule. One afternoon in late June, Chris and I sat on the back porch while Leela hunted for pottery shards in the garden. The heat was thick, but the breeze held a whisper of something kind. Chris leaned back in her chair, eyes closed. "I used to think being right was the same as being strong," she said. "Now I think being strong might be knowing when to come back." I didn't reply, but I reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. The museum sent over a proof of the exhibit layout. My field journals would be digitized, my voice narrating select pieces. They asked if I wanted to record something fresh or use what was already archived. I chose fresh. This time, I wanted to speak directly, to say the names, to leave no part of the story silent. Ray and I still shared long evenings. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. But the kitchen table was no longer just a place where stories ended. It had become a place where they were passed on. A few days before the exhibit opened, Chris brought over a framed photo of the 3 of us, Me, her, and Leela taken under the shade of the elm tree in the backyard. For your office at the museum, she said. If you want it. I hung it near the door. Now when I sit in the quiet of the exhibit watching strangers lean in to hear my voice, I no longer feel the ache of what was taken. I feel the strength of what remains, the life rebuilt, the hands held, the questions answered. Sometimes justice doesn't come as thunder. Sometimes it arrives softly in a child's curiosity, in a daughter's return, in a name once erased spoken aloud again with care. Thank you for listening to my story. And if you've ever had to find your way back to yourself through silence, through distance, through time, know that you're not alone. Leave a comment, share your story if you'd like, or just take a breath and know you made it.